So it was recently announced that Dissidia Opera Omnia will be coming to an end. However, Tetsuya Nomura has some rather hopeful comments to reassure fans in regards to the future of Dissidia. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe. It is always appreciated. So if you're not familiar with Dissidia Opera Omnia, it's a pretty big mobile game from Square Enix that takes the universe of Dissidia, all of its heroes and villains, and puts them into their own unique story campaign. And it's been pretty successful for the past few years. Square has consistently supported it, and there seems to be a pretty large player base that loves playing it. And content does get added regularly. New characters, new weapons, new bosses, new story events. It's a pretty healthy game. It's a bit overwhelming. I have played it myself, and there's menus upon menus upon menus, and so many different story threads and chapters to go through. It can be a bit much to absorb. But the gameplay itself is pretty fun. It's like a turn-based RPG that takes elements of Dissidia, like the bravery system and the HP system, and incorporates all that with the turn-based stuff, and it's rather fun. It's super cool. It's like a big fan service love letter game to Final Fantasy fans. And this was all spawned off of the Dissidia fighting game franchise, which we will get to in just a second. But with the announcement that they're shutting Dissidia Opera Omnia down, Tetsuya Nomura did have some comments to reassure fans to let them know that Dissidia itself is not dead. And these comments come to us from Ibo_AC7 on Twitter, and were then translated by Audrey. And these comments originated from Nomura from a Japanese live stream where he talked about the whole situation with Opera Omnia. So the first thing we're going to go over is that Nomura says, even though this is the end of Opera Omnia, he still would like to think about what they could do for the Dissidia Final Fantasy series. They will try their best to perhaps even have a new title for the series in the future. So again, a new title for Dissidia sounds pretty awesome. Now, what title does that end up being? Do you continue the path of Opera Omnia where you do a more story-driven game, but this time on consoles, or does this mean a new Dissidia fighting game? Now, a long while back, I proposed the idea of taking Dissidia Opera Omnia and making it into this really big budget RPG 40+ hour event where all of the heroes come together and they have to travel through all of the different multiverse Final Fantasy worlds to stop Shinryu from enacting some sort of plan. It's all very bare bones, but I really love the idea of taking Dissidia Opera Omnia from mobile and really trying to make it into a big budget, fully fledged RPG, which would take quite some time to create, especially because you have to consider all of the characters you'd be including and all of their movesets and abilities, the areas that they would be traveling to, the enemies they would be fighting. It might be a bit too overwhelming and unrealistic to expect an RPG based off of Opera Omnia that's big budget. But I really love the idea of doing that, and I think that that could work. And I think I even did a series on that quite some time ago before my channel kind of like blew up a little bit. So I'll leave links to that stuff in the description and in this video if you'd like to check those out. But let's assume that they abandon the Opera Omnia route and go back to Dissidia as a fighting game franchise. Now, I love the Dissidia series. It started off as a one-on-one fighter on PSP that was awesome, and then it spawned the sequel Duodecim, which was also awesome, which then spawned to the arcade version, which then got ported over to the PlayStation 4, Dissidia NT. Now, Dissidia NT is probably the redheaded stepchild of the Dissidia franchise. I'm like one of 10 people that genuinely enjoyed it. I put hundreds upon hundreds of hours into playing that game on PS4. I had a blast. I genuinely really liked it. I thought the character class system was interesting. I genuinely enjoyed the 3v3 aspect of combat and working together with your team to pull out the win. The netcode was hit or miss because it was peer-to-peer, so some matches were super laggy, but every once in a while you would have a match that had a great, solid connection. And when you had that solid connection and a team of people by your side that were communicating, using the chat features, backing you up in battle, it was an incredible feeling, and it became very addictive. I would spend 2-3 hours playing Dissidia NT, just having a blast online back when the game was, more heavily populated, and, really enjoying myself. So I would really personally love to see them continue the fighting game side of Dissidia. And again, I'm in the minority here with I wouldn't mind them going back to the 3v3 aspect, but I did do another series talking about this very subject of how you could change up the fighting game aspect of Dissidia. maybe keeping the 3v3, but instead of doing the arena fighter, which Dissidia is known for, you could maybe do a much more traditional fighting game, like a 2D/3D fighting game in the vein of like Marvel vs. Capcom or Dragon Ball FighterZ, where you have a team of 3 characters made of heroes or villains going against another team of 3 heroes or villains. I think that could be super cool. Having like light attacks, medium attacks, heavy attacks, launchers, I think could be a ton of fun. But of course, Square Enix, Nomura, I think they're probably going to want to try something a bit different with the Dissidia franchise. I think they will still keep the fighting game aspect of it alive, but I would fully expect them to do something different. Now, the next thing is the roster. Obviously, you'd have to include the classic characters from the previous Dissidia games, but you'd have to also add in some new ones. And the 2 characters I would love to see added to a Dissidia game are, of course, Jack Garland, the Jack version from Stranger of Paradise, because he was genuinely a very endearing character. I know there were so many memes made on Jack and how weird his dialogue was and his attitude and how he was very much like early to mid 2000s emo rock man with so much edge. But as a character, Jack was actually genuinely very interesting, and if you played through Stranger of Paradise and its DLC, there was so much more character added to the character of Jack Garland. I thought he was actually genuinely really likable and interesting. And then of course, you gotta put in Clive from Final Fantasy 16. A conversation between Clive and like Cloud and Squall would be sick. A conversation between Jack and anyone from that roster especially would be sick. But Clive in particular has such a massive moveset of abilities that could be integrated into the Dissidia fighting game system that I think would be super cool. And come on now, tell me that this wouldn't be sick. A fight scene in CG between Clive and Sephiroth. That shit would be dope. 2 badass, awesome characters duking it out. Clive pulling out every iconic ability he's got. Sephiroth barely breaking a sweat. That would be insanely cool to witness. And just hearing Ben Starr come back to reprise his role as Clive and knowing how much he loves Final Fantasy VIII, seeing Clive have a conversation with Squall would just be so sick. And then of course there's the rumored DLC characters that unfortunately never made it into Dissidia NT before it got cancelled. I believe Vivi from Final Fantasy IX was one of them. I think Zack from Final Fantasy VII was also rumored to be a part of that roster at some point, but unfortunately they never made it in. Now, that's the hero side of things. What do you do for the villain side of things? For 16 in particular, do you include Ultima as a villain to represent 16 in the next Dissidia? Or do you pick one of the lower level villains like a Barnabas to have him represent the villains of 16? Or do you just have a situation where you put Clive in and he has no villain representative until later down the line in DLC? Either way, I'm a huge fan of Dissidia. I really would love to see it come back with the arena fighter stuff, maybe tweak some stuff here and there, but to keep Dissidia alive and to know that Nomura is still thinking about Dissidia and that he wants to do another one, that's a very good sign. That adds a lot of hope to the Dissidia community that this franchise will come back in some form or another. With that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below. What would you guys like to see in the next Dissidia? Would you like to see them go back to the fighting game roots of Dissidia with the one-on-one stuff? Did you like the 3-on-3 stuff? Or would you rather them attempt a big budget version of Opera Omnia that would have this really grand story? And what character, good or bad, would you like to see added to the next Dissidia? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.